Hi, welcome to the first episode of Startup Strides. Today, my guest is Rabii Malik. He's the CEO and co-founder of Remo. Welcome, Rabii. Very nice to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. I'm really excited for this episode. I have some questions prepared. If I look to the side, it's because I'm looking at my questions on my iPad, just to paying full attention to you. Rami, you have a very interesting background, and you've done quite a few things. I guess my first question is always about the backgrounds. You graduated from Oxford, you worked at McKinsey for a bit, and then you moved on to Telda, where you were involved in the international expansion. If you want to keep climbing the corporate ladder, you could have been ways you could have done it, right? Like kept doing it. But you decided to switch to entrepreneurship, which is obviously a very rewarding journey, but it's also very intense, very risky. Why did you decide to take that leap? What made you?
Yeah, that's a great question. You said it's easy to climb the corporate ladder.
Yeah.
I think for certain people, I'm sure it is. And you're right. I could have stayed at McKinsey for 5 years, 10 years, for longer, and many people do. But I think it also depends on sort of what you're looking for in your career. And I think for myself, I always knew I was more motivated when I was working for myself or working on something that I had more of a passion for. Now that we've taken the leap to start Remo and been building now for almost 8 or 9 months now, I think it's just clear that the level of motivation is so much higher, and therefore the amount we're willing to work, the way we work is just so much more productive. So for myself, that was the biggest driving force of sort of getting into entrepreneurship. It was kind of to escape the rat race, basically. It means we end up working more, but at least we're working towards stuff that we care about.
Got it. So it's the ownership and the process itself that makes you really excited.
Absolutely.
Well, now I guess you already mentioned Remo, right? Let's talk about Remo. What Remo is, what's solving, and what made you. I think it's you're tackling a challenge in the compliance space. What made you pursue this specific goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at Remo, we're building a set of AI tools for compliance teams. Our primary product right now helps banks and fintechs onboard their business customers instantly. What I mean by that is right now, if a bank or a fintech wants to onboard a business customer, normally they have a team of analysts who are picking up these cases. And the cases, for them to successfully onboard a business, typically they need to review a number of manual documents, cross-reference, do database checks, look at the online presence of the business. It's quite manual and frankly quite tedious work. And as a financial institution scales, often they struggle because they then need to scale their onboarding team as well. As they scale their onboarding team, typically that introduces human error. It introduces scaling costs. There's no economies of scale on sort of these operations, because then you need like quality assurance as well. So what we do is we help these banks and fintechs automate that process. It saves them time. It therefore saves them costs, but it also allows them to offer a much, much better customer experience towards the businesses that they're onboarding. I'm not sure if you've ever opened a business bank account, but typically, if you ever go through that process, you have to wait days to get a response, and then often they ask for more information. It starts a back and forth. It takes a few weeks before they have all the documents that they need, and then they still need to review it. In our case, in real time, we're able to tell whether all the documents are there. We're able to give a go or no go decision immediately. And then to take it into a more nuanced approach, we can also risk score these customers as well. And so for some of our clients, they actually want to lend to their end customer. They want to underwrite their end customer. And therefore, all these alternative data sources, they start to become very valuable. And so we've plugged into things like Google Maps reviews, Instagram accounts, other sorts of sources. And the reality is businesses today are not just brick and mortar. Most of them are online. That's where the growth is. And it's much, much harder to understand the identity of those businesses. So we really want to not just allow these banks and fintechs to onboard their customers faster, but really create the standard in business identity. And that really unlocks so many other business models that our customers offer to their end customers.
Got it.
I can speak a bit about sort of how we got into this as well.
Yeah, yeah.
On that front, look, so I spent 2.5 years working at a fintech startup, and I saw very closely many of the manual processes we had to go through. I was responsible for helping us get live and licensed across various jurisdictions, and I spent a lot of time talking to regulators about sort of where these policies and processes come from. And typically it comes from an approach of managing risk, right? And it makes sense. But the reality is, if you have too much of this, you then start to encroach on the customer experience as well. And so what we're really doing is asking ourselves, like, how do we do all the processes that need to be done to manage risks, but at the same time offer the best customer experience possible? And so being close to that problem sort of inspired us to take a deeper look. And over the last 9 months, we've spoken to hundreds of banks and fintechs, compliance team members, and really deeply understood what they want. And what they want is they want to be able to be free of the manual and repetitive work and spend their time on the more interesting parts of their job, where they're really looking at understanding risk from a more nuanced perspective, where they're really looking at product rather than process. And so we really give them that opportunity as well.
Got it. You're essentially focusing on streamlining the process and make it as much as easier for both parties, right? Um,
Exactly.
sometimes we see problems and we're like, okay, there's a problem, and somebody needs to do something about it, right? When I'm just curious about your thought process and your approach to that. When were you like, okay, do you have like an aha moment? You were like, okay, this is actually a problem, and we should start building in it? Because sometimes taking that leap, making that jump to, okay, there's a problem, but also we have to start building in that. How do you approach that?
It's a great question, and I wish often people tell the story as if there was a single moment where you were like, at this point I knew I must solve this. There was many moments, right, where the dots start to connect, but the
Mm-hmm.
reality is, like, you build conviction over time. So I saw some of the when I take the example of Telda, we were onboarding thousands of customers, and I saw very clearly that we were struggling with the onboarding operations. Our partner bank was struggling with the onboarding operations. It was a consumer process, but at the same time, the same principles applied. And I kept asking myself, there must be a better way here, right? But the reality is, for us to really get full conviction, we spoke to maybe more than 50 banks and fintechs before we even wrote a single line of code. And that really helped us put ourselves in the shoes of our customers, right? These were not open-ended conversations about, how do you spend your time? What are your biggest pain points? It was very thesis driven. We already knew that this problem existed. It was much more about what are the details, what are the nuances, what are the things that we
Mm-hmm.
might not understand, right? We even effectively shadowed, even today, we spend a lot of time with our customers where we just watch them do the job in a manual way, because we learn a lot from watching them, right? And so my point there is that it's a gradual process where you build more and more conviction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even today, I know sort of what our product looks like. I know what's on our roadmap, but maybe 2 years from now, we're actually building for a slightly different reality, right? Because of course, the market is always changing. What customers need is always changing, and it's not just one thing that you do once and you know exactly what you need to build. You always have to be in that discovery mode.
Got it. That's fascinating. So essentially having a core vision, core idea, and then building around it by just gathering as many details as possible.
Exactly.
Um, you worked in fintech, so obviously you know it way better than I do. It's not really my area of understanding or expertise at all. But all I know is finance and compliance tend to be like really complex and tend to be also very regulated.
Mhm.
What have been some of the biggest challenges you face, since the beginning of your journey?
Yeah, from a regulation perspective, or
From just really building in the space, right? Like I feel
yeah,
like biotech has its own challenges,
yeah.
deep tech has its own challenges, and I'm curious about like building in the space. What made you, yeah.
Yeah, look, building for financial services definitely has its own nuances as well. Of course, there's very, very high levels of um, data security considerations. It varies by jurisdiction. So there's a lot of complexities there. So, for example, I saw a lot of things in the Middle East, because that's where I've been spending a lot of time. But then, as we started to onboard US customers, we saw a lot of differences in the US, right? And now, every week we talk to a customer in a new geography and we ask ourselves, like, what's different here, right? We need to be open-minded. We need to sometimes do research before we're able to confidently say that, hey, here's how we can apply our learnings or our product in a new geography. So I definitely think that, like, that variation is definitely quite a challenge, and it's something that we're getting better and better at solving. The next thing I would probably say is just on the data security side, there's a lot of precautions we had to take. We've gone through a SOC 2 compliance process to make sure that banks that we sell to are sort of aware of the processes that we take to make sure that data is secure. So there's a lot of these considerations, and frankly, um, compliance teams are a little bit more risk averse than maybe some other functions. Like a marketing team, for example, might be more willing to adopt a new technology than a compliance team. But that is a pro and a con, right? Because
Mm,
reality is it creates a bit of defensibility. It means that, if we're able to speak their language, if we're able to build a product that speaks to them, um, it's not as easy for the next person to come along and just sell to them as well, right? And there is a lot of learnings that we've had in that process. For example, a lot of players in the AI space saw the hype around AI agents over the last year, and we saw a lot of compliance players talking about AI agents, and they took kind of a blanket approach. Whereas in our case, a lot of our flows are agentic, but at the same time, we recognize that compliance teams want to have humans in the loop. They want to have auditable outcomes so that they can track everything that's happening. They want explainability. They want to have visibility into how the model is making its decision. They want to have visibility into biases. These are all super interesting insights, which create a burden on the product, but at the same time, once you build it, it also creates defensibility. And so there's a bunch of these challenges which are like fintech specific. But we found that, again, as you start to overcome them, it helps you create a stronger product.
Got it. You see, you mentioned two things, which I want to I also have follow-up questions on that, but you already touched upon them, so I'm going to ask them now. One thing is the customer feedback. You talked a lot of customers from all over the place. And obviously, a lot of people say like customer feedback is very important because you get a feedback, you iterate on the product, you ask more questions, you iterate on the product, and it's kind of like a cycle, right? But also you have to be mindful of it because like if you do too many iterations and you listen to too many different ideas, then you essentially diverge too much and you might risk losing the product market fit, right? How do you balance that?
That's a great question. Look, I think customers are the best place to learn about the problem. They're not necessarily the best place to learn about the product. What I mean by that is when we speak to customers, we are really focused on what challenges do they have and how can we deeply understand that. Then it's up to us to decide. Of course, there's still some customer feedback here as well, but then it's up to us to make the decision on what does the product response to that look like. Because this is really where innovation comes from, right? If somebody came to me, it's like, someone coming to me and saying, a couple hundred years ago, saying, there's a horse-drawn carriage, I want it to go faster, let's add more horses, right? And then I go and add more horses, and I'm like, great, it's going faster. But actually, what they wanted was a car, right? And if I took it from like first principles and asked myself, what technology is available, I'd build a car. But if I took it from just what they're recommending, I would just add more horses, right? And so we also bridge the gap between compliance teams and the state of art in AI. And so on that front, we often come to teams and introduce concepts and ideas that they didn't realize was possible. So even just this morning, I had a demo call with a team, and they were talking a little bit about what they wish existed, and we were, taken aback a little bit because we're like, we can actually offer a lot of these things already. It's not like rocket science. It's not something that is unfeasible from a technical perspective. And so keeping that balance, you're right, is super important. It's definitely a skill to be mastered. Like I won't say we've cracked it completely. Every time a customer asks for something, in my head, I'm like prioritizing it a little bit more, right? But at the same time, we have to trust ourselves. And there is this sense of like product intuition that I think you build over time. I've had some experience on that at Telda, at Remo so far, but I do think that's something that we hope to get better at as entrepreneurs as well.
Got it. So just to summarize what you said, essentially, you develop your own intuition, you have your own idea, you listen to the feedback, and you hear the problems. But essentially, the direction and evolution the project, the company will take is at the end is up to you, not up to the customer, right? Got it.
Exactly, and honestly, the market does respond as well, right? If we then launch something into the market and our customers don't use it, it's very clear in the metrics that we made the wrong decisions, right? And maybe then we need to iterate again.
Yeah.
Obviously, at some once you hit a certain level of scale, metrics tell all the story. It requires you to have a bit of scale, so we're a little bit early, so we are leaning on our own intuition a little bit more than you might maybe at Series A, for example.
Got it. And you mentioned AI, which lately I feel like AI might be my generation's kind of industrial revolution. It's definitely gonna change a lot, especially in the probably like 5 to 10 years. Once we improve on our AI capabilities, and every company now is using AI, and you'll probably see a bit too much hype because I guess it's one of the ways to raise funding, because I feel like anytime I go on any company's website, it's saying leveraging AI capabilities, but a lot of companies use it very effectively, and I believe your company is using AI, leveraging AI capabilities too. I'm curious, how do you see AI sort of like defining the future of compliance, and how, as Remo, you were kind of trying to stay at the forefront of that evolution?
Absolutely, that's a great question. Look, as you mentioned and as you alluded to, AI models are getting better every week, even. So it is our responsibility partially to just like stay up to date with that as well, right? Obviously, that's not all we spend our time on, but at the end of the day, as things improve, we need to be like, how do we leverage that and make sure that we are, delivering the best product to the customer? This manifests itself in two ways. One is our internal operations. Our engineering team, our CTO, um, use Cursor. It allows them to be significantly more productive. Um, we're talking about very quick turnaround on features. You know, just yesterday I had a potential customer say, "Hey, I would love this feature," and then I share with them a demo, but then I also then tell them, "Hey, we actually just launched the feature that you mentioned," right? And it's because we can actually just be so much more efficient with the code that we write. And this is going to apply to other parts of our business as well. When we think about marketing, when we think about sales, there's a lot of these automations that we're now able to leverage, and it means we can build our business with significantly fewer team members for the same level of output. The second thing that I would mention here is how it manifests itself on the customer-facing side. Sorry, I'm going to turn Slack off.
It's
But
fine, don't worry.
if you're going to keep this part of the edit in, my co-founder is messaging me on Slack right now about how good AI is on design, right? So we were actually looking at hiring a designer to do some designs, and he's been experimenting with some AI tools, and we're like, actually, crap, like maybe we can just do this using some AI tools. Literally, that's the message that he's sending me right now. So it's very, very to the point of
Very,
saying,
yeah. I'm
look,
gonna
in
definitely keep it. I'm keeping it then.
Look, from the side of the compliance teams, I think this is super powerful, right? Because
Mhm.
over the last 10 years, there has been a lot of innovation in compliance, but it's been focused on supervised machine learning.
Mhm.
The areas where you can improve OCR, where you can improve identity verification, and those other areas where you can have labeled trained data sets and automate processes, right? But now with LLMs, what we're actually able to do is deal with the more unstructured data in a way that's really, really scalable. So when I think about much more complex documents, when I think about the online presence of a business, when I'm thinking about making a judgment call based off of a complex data set, when I'm thinking about adverse media screening, often you have a lot of false positives with sort of certain names, for example. There's a lot better data check. There's a lot significantly better checks that we can do. And this is, again, it's not just improving the compliance, it's also improving the customer experience, right?
Mhm.
It's unlocking new products that they can build, and they're able to take on a more nuanced perspective on the risk that they take on as a business. And for us, that's like super, super exciting. Um, I think now we have the opportunity to automate like 60-70% of that manual work, whereas previously you could only automate maybe 10 or 20% of it. And reality is the better AI models get, the more of that work we can automate. Compliance is one of those functions where I don't envisage that 5 years from now that there's no compliance officers. It's just the role that they have is different. It's supervisory, it's checking, it's quality assurance, it's dealing with edge cases, it's dealing with more complex parts of the product. And for us,
Yeah,
again, that's really exciting because it allows people to have more fulfilling roles, right?
yeah,
Rather than doing manual tasks, they're instead doing the things that they're really engaged with.
got it. Um, that's really interesting. But you also mentioned that it's very important to have human oversight, especially in things like compliance. So you believe in the balance of AI and also having the human oversight, right?
100%. Yeah. Look, what we're doing is we're not building AI agents and we're not building AI coworkers. We are building software that improves the lives of compliance teams, improves the processes of compliance teams, and we're leveraging AI to do that, right? That means a lot of processes are automated. That means there are agentic flows. At the end of the day, the compliance officer is at the heart of everything we build for. We're not asking how do we replace the compliance officer. We're asking how do we make them 100 times more efficient and how do we make them love their jobs.
Got it. Um, Rabi, what I'm curious about is like you are building a company. Obviously, you have some experience in fintech and in the finance industry, but also you're still learning a lot by talking to customers. But also you're learning things that like AI is very highly technical, which you studied PPE at Oxford, politics, philosophy, economics. So it's kind of like outside of your kind of expertise area. You're learning at the same time, but also you're implementing and incorporating at the same time, and also you're managing a team. How are you balancing so many things at the same time?
Very poorly at the moment. Look, the reality is, right, and this is another part of being a founder, and especially the early stages, you have to allocate your resources very carefully. You have to prioritize really carefully. And it's not easy. I've made a lot of mistakes over the last few months in terms of I should have prioritized X. I ended up doing Y. And things fall through the cracks. The only thing we can do is try and improve that process every single time. It's again, we're still iterating, right? We're iterating on our own processes and the way that we work. For me, over the Christmas break, for example, I had a chance to reflect on a lot of things and ask myself, what should I be prioritizing? Where should I be spending my time? How do I do that in a way that's more manageable? The good thing is we are a relatively small team, and therefore we have a lot less of the meetings that you might expect. We actually work in person from the office primarily. We do travel quite a bit, but we generally are in the office most of the time, and that fosters really good collaboration without having to block time off. What I do is I block time off for the more time intensive and the more sort of deeper work that's required, right? Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator, has a great essay called Make a Schedule, Manage a Schedule, where he just talks about sort of the type of timekeeping you need to have to do deep work, to do innovative work, versus being a manager where you have 10 meetings in a day and you have 30-minute slots here and there. And frankly, I iterate between the two. I try to keep a couple of days in the week where I don't have meetings. On the weekends, I typically don't have meetings. On Wednesdays, I try to avoid meetings. And so that's normally how I've set things up. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of context switching. And as an entrepreneur, that's probably the most powerful skill, is being able to jump in and out of different tasks and still do them really well.
Got it. You mentioned your co-founder, you mentioned the team. So I'm going to ask a question about the team. Co-founders, I'm going to ask you a story about how you met your co-founder, but usually co-founders tend to be, the friends or people you went to school with. But then it comes to a point, especially once you raise some funding, you have to hire new people, right? And I feel like it's very important to hire the right people in its early stages, because later, you can fly, obviously it's important still, but there's a bit of a legroom, right? But the early stages, like the defining core team. How do you approach that? Not just the co-founder, but also like the beyond.
Yeah, maybe I can talk about my co-founder first. My co-founder's name is Hashim. He has spent about 4.5, 5 years as an engineer at Deliveroo and then Careem, which is Uber in the Middle East. He actually went to university with my brother, which is at the same university, and they weren't. They were a few years apart. So I've known of him for a while, and then he moved to Dubai, where I was living about 2.5 years ago, and we ended up becoming really good friends. And then every time we saw each other, we would talk about startups. We would send each other YC videos. We would be talking about this idea that we're exploring. He was working on a few things, I was working on a few things. It felt inevitable that we would eventually start a company together, so it was like a matter of time. But for me, the most important thing was that I trusted him, right? Of course, he has that technical ability, and he's worked at some incredible organizations. But at the same time, like for me, that co-founder relationship is honestly like, of course, there is a minimum threshold of can you do a certain role and have that complementary skill set. But at the end of the day, it was about, do I trust this person? Is this someone that I want to make deeper decisions alongside of, right? And Hashim ticked that box for me, and I'm super glad to have the privilege to sort of work alongside him. In terms of building the team, you're right, and the honest truth is hiring is always the most important thing, right? Even when you're a big company and you're hiring your 100th employee. For us, when we're in the early stages, we've hired our first founding engineer. We're making a couple more hires over the next few months, and we're really just focused on, again, maintaining that culture of people who are product focused, people who put the experience of building and sort of solving a customer problem at the forefront of what they do. We really value people who have founder experience. So our first founding engineer actually spent a little bit of time starting a company. He also had a lot of experience managing teams, even though he's an individual contributor today and he prefers to be an individual contributor. That means that he has a growth potential to be a leader in the company when, hopefully we scale to a bigger team size. And then also at the end, he also had industry specific experience as well. So he really ticked a lot of boxes for us. And, we're super happy to have him on the team. When I think about going forward, for us, that culture fit again is super important early on. Finding those people who don't just see this as a task to be done and something they, just get done and, move on with, but have that ownership mindset. And obviously that's compensated accordingly as well, both in terms of equity and salary. But we really want people who take that ownership mindset over everything that they do. And it doesn't even have to be in the engineering output only. When we take Ben, who's our founding engineer, he joins sales calls, he iterates with us on our website, We bring him into those conversations because we trust his judgment, but also because we're building this company together. It's not a business. It's not a role where he just comes in, we tell him what to do. It's we're collaborative. We're building this together, and that's the mindset and culture we want to build in the long term as well. I feel like the best businesses have that. If you look at a company like Revolut, right, a lot of the senior leaders in the business are it's almost like they're founders, right? At least that's how they talk about the business. At least that's how they build. At least that's how they like sort of spend their time on the business, and that's really the culture we want to create as well.
Got it. Just to ask a follow-up question. Um, Obviously it's very important to have this founder, this ambitious mindset, and to have the ownership. But also, I feel like that also creates, and I'm not talking about your company per se. I'm just looking in general. This create like those people also tend to be very like
Yeah.
opinionated. I can't speak, but you got what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And they have their own kind of, and then you have your own vision.
Mhm.
So sometimes conflicts are obviously bound to rise.
Absolutely.
How do you think like how one should approach solving that? Because you have your own vision. Obviously, you have a vision for the companies. They might have an opinion, an idea that's good or not good. But like, how do you approach it so it's smooth but it's also efficient?
That's a good question. One of our things that we believe very strongly is that the best idea wins, right? It doesn't matter where it comes from. And this is something that we sort of uh, we want to emulate that value forever, right? Because at the end of the day, like my perspective on what the business should look like shouldn't hold extra weight just because I'm a founder, right?
Mm, mm,
Um, sure, we are the ones that make the final decisions, and there is a hierarchy, right? Don't get me wrong. I can't say that there's no hierarchy. Um, there is, of course, but at the end of the day, like if an intern joins us and the intern says, "Hey, and we're like say a 10-person team, and the intern says, "Hey, I think we should do X on the marketing," and I say, "Hey, I think we should do Y," um, we will both have our reasons, right? And I'm it's very, very possible I'm going to be wrong, right? I don't know that much about marketing either, right? What we tend to do in our approach to decision making is we trust everybody, and because we trust everybody and we know what everyone's spikes are, if somebody insists on a certain approach and they have the expertise as well, we defer to them, right? Of course, if we have data that indicates otherwise, we then bring that up and have that open discussion. And the reality is, we are very iterative even on this process because let's say we take a decision, but it ends up being the wrong one. We ask ourselves, why was that the case, right? Why did we land on
mm.
the wrong decision? But at the end of the day, because Hashim is leading our technical efforts, I'm leading our sales efforts. I'm much closer to the sales work. He's much closer to the technical work. If I say to him, "Hey, no, this feature should take a day," and he tells me, "No, it's going to take 4 days," um, I mean, of course, I should trust his judgment, right? And then if Hashim's telling Ben, who's our founding engineer, "Hey, this thing's going to take this amount of time," but Ben's been closer to that product, we would trust his judgment, right? And of course, with that trust comes the associated responsibility. But we believe that if we operate this way, and we continue to sort of make sure that we uh, encourage those like sort of open conversations,
Mm.
it's not about stroking someone's ego, right? It's about making sure that the best things happening for the business, for the customers, and that only happens if we open up those avenues.
Got it. Very, very, very good points. You obviously worked at Telda for international expansion, but you're in early stages of Remo, so I'm not going to ask a question about Remo's growth ambitions right now. But I'm curious because growing a startup is very interesting phase because you obviously want to scale, but also you want to maintain profitability, and you also want to make sure that you make use of the funds smartly.
Absolutely.
Um, at the later stages, as you mentioned, you can look at the metrics, you look at the signals, and based on that make certain decisions. But in the early stages, it's kind of like you also follow a bit of your intuition, right?
Mhm.
What are some of the key learnings you learned about expansion and growth, and how do you think startups should approach it strategically?
That's a good question. Look, like even today, when I tell you we serve banks and fintechs, it's very broad, right? And different types of fintechs have different needs, and that affects our product roadmap. Right now, we have, I would say, maybe 3 customer profiles, um, and often we take demos with customers and they ask for something different. Maybe it's like something on our product roadmap but quite low down. Then we have to do the judgment call of like, hey, who do we serve? Are we prioritizing something? Are we not prioritizing something? And it's ever evolving. Um, for us, I think like the very first thing is to crack who is that ideal customer profile. Who are we building for? And it can't be as broad as what I'm saying, right? banks and fintechs, sure, but is it fintechs that are lending? Is it fintechs that are based in the US? Is there a geography difference? So there's all these things, and frankly, like as we spoke to more and more customers, we learn more ourselves, and we're able to prioritize more ourselves as well. And I think once what you're really trying to do is hit product market fit, right? And it's an elusive concept. There's lots of different definitions there. Some people say that it implies a certain growth rate over a certain period of time. Others say it's a feeling, and like when you have it, and if you have to ask, you don't have it. So it's one of those things. And at that point, then you can put more fuel on the fire, right? Then you can be a lot more aggressive. And when you have more repeatable processes, you can be a lot more aggressive. So I think in the early stages, honestly, it is about running experiments, but then it's also about focusing. And they're almost like two sides of the same coin, because again, running different experiments means you're doing a lot of different things, but being focused, requires focus. And so you really need to balance both of those things until you're able to say, hey, for this customer, I'm delivering this value. Here's why it's a competitive product. Here's what the size of the market is. Here's how many customers we have today. Here's how we could scale it if we had, these 4 additional features, or if we had, more salespeople, whatever it might be. And so right now we're definitely focused on cracking that product market fit. And at some point it will be much more about, okay, cool. How do we expand from here in a more calculated way, right?
Mm.
Because we are always building new products. We're also always doing sales. So we are expanding, but I think it becomes more and more calculated over time.
Got it. Well, now my next question is going to be about fundraising and
Sure.
getting that investor interest. I know you were part of the YC Combinator. I'm sure there were a lot of good lessons and learning and experiences there. But I think fundraising is really important, but it's also not easy, right? I mean, obviously you have to have a pitch deck and whatever. The general concepts are easy, but the process itself is really differs from the person to person. It really depends on your storytelling, how you sell it, the investors. I guess one question I have is, how do you make sure that, like, you're building a company in the compliance space, right? Which not every investor will have a background in compliance or finance, but
Yeah.
they have the finance, they have the money to invest in. How do you make sure that they resonate with the problem? How do you approach it? Now, I'm just curious about your approach to fundraising in general. So let's first go with this question, then I can ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, look, I think fundraising in general, look, the better your company is, the easier your fundraise should be, right? But then at the end of the day, it's still a sales process, because you are selling a piece of your company for, it should be a partnership, but really you're selling a piece of your company, right? And effectively, when we're doing sales, it's about the quality of the product, right? And it's also the storytelling. These are the two things that matter. And even when we're selling Remo to financial services firms, we are improving our product all the time. We're improving our storytelling all the time, right? It's the same thing as we're doing in fundraising, right? And so when you think about those two levers, you can always go back to focusing on your business and improving, your metrics, improving how many customers you're serving, etc. That's one way to improve your fundraising. And then the second is the storytelling. On the storytelling side, you kind of alluded to it already, that there are different levels of familiarity with the industry. And I won't say again that we know exactly how to deal with this, but doing the best job that you can to illustrate the pain points and make it as real as possible, I think is super, super helpful. This is something that, we have to learn. Is that, like you said, most people don't actually know how these processes work. And if you assume that they do, they will just zone out, right? They'll just be like, oh, okay, cool. Just sounds like something, bit generic, bit random. But if I tell them, hey, like, here is one of our customers. Here is how they used to operate before the Remo. Here's how they operate after Remo. Here's the time saving. Here's the value we created for them. Here's a testimonial from them. All of a sudden, it becomes much, much realer, right? And then the next question might be like, how big is the market? And then I can answer that question, right? But at least it's grounded in this idea that we are creating value and we are capturing some of that value as well. And I think the moment you can demonstrate those two things really well, then it becomes about scalability, about execution, about all these other things. But if you don't have those first two ingredients, then you're talking about a lot of concepts without grounding them in anything.
Very interesting. So essentially what you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm getting from this is that instead of starting very abstractly and talking about this varied concepts, you're like, this is an issue. This is like a pragmatic example of what's happening, how we're solving. You're essentially giving a very, like, a life, well, what's the right word for it? Essentially, you're just depicting the problem from the client's perspective, what you're doing about it. And I feel like when you give an example like that, it's easier to understand, right?
100%. Like,
Yeah.
to put it more simply, the problem and solution slides are the most important part of your pitch deck or any fundraising material that you have. Because if somebody does not understand those two, everything else is frankly useless, right?
Got it.
And different people will have different levels of familiarity with the industry, and so maybe you even need different types of materials for different investors, right?
Mm,
Maybe if you know someone's a fintech investor, maybe you give them something that's more detailed, right? If somebody
mm.
is a generalist investor, maybe you give them something that's a little bit higher level, a little bit more easy to understand.
Got it. One question and one thing I've had conversations with different founders, and they've had differing experiences. I'm not asking anything confidential or specific to you. I'm just
Sure.
curious about your opinion. Is that raising essentially deciding on how much you want to raise, right? Because
Mm,
you don't want to give up too much equity, and
absolutely, yeah,
the more you ask, the more kind of like complex it becomes to negotiate and getting investor interest. Also, you want to have enough so you continue building and you don't run out of funds. What's
absolutely.
your thinking process? What's your take on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, most people say that again, like you said, there's two schools of thought here, right? Some people say raise as much as you can, raise when you don't need to raise, or it's always good to have money, which I understand and I empathize. And now, as someone who's managing runway, it is important and it makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. But it's also a bit of a trap, right? Because you start to hire more people even when you don't have the right direction. Um, when you're a little bit less free with the money that you have, you can be a bit more milestone oriented. Tom Blomfield was our group partner at YC, and he told us a very funny story, which is he did YC a while back with a company called Go Cardless, and he told us that he made a hiring plan and he made a sales plan, and he met all the targets on his hiring plan, and he didn't meet any of the targets on his sales plan. And the point was that, even though he hired like all these people, they weren't hitting the milestones that they needed to hit, but they should have been linked. Those two plans should be very, very linked to one another, right? It should be that you hit certain milestones and then you hire more people. It shouldn't be that one is a plan independently of the other. I think this is the trap that a lot of people fall into, which is, they raise $3 million and they're like, all right, let me go and hire 10 people, right? But hiring people is not going to solve your problem when you don't know how to solve your problem. Um,
Mm,
in the early days, like I said, it's about finding product market fit, and there is this balance, right? I wouldn't. Some people go to the other extreme and they say bootstrap, build everything yourself, get to $100,000 of revenue, and then hire people. So there is that level of trade off, but the reality is, you can be sensible with how much you raise, prove out hypotheses, and once you de-risk different pieces of the business, you can say, all right, cool, now's the time for me to take more risk or raise more money, or you know, this is the thing I'm trying to validate. And when you take that approach, it's just so much more falsifiable, right? If I'm saying that, I think that with 3 people I can get to $100,000 of monthly revenue, that's a target that I can actually like move towards. And if I don't hit it, I can ask myself, why did I not hit it? Was it that I didn't hire enough engineers? Is it that I haven't hired enough, you know, I haven't hired someone for marketing? What might it be? You can just be a lot more specific about what you're trying to solve for.
got it. I guess my takeaways from what you said is that having a lean team initially is important because
Absolutely.
it makes it easier to manage them. Also, it makes it easier to understand what's going right and what's going wrong. But
Exactly.
also, you said having a bit of a money pressure is also good because you are more focused on actually like hitting the targets instead of being like, oh, let's experiment and see where is this going, right?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
right?
I think that's exactly right. And I would also say that when you think about it from the team's perspective as well, of course they want to feel comfortable, right? They want to feel like they know that, hey, we have space to figure this out. But you also don't want to be in a situation where it's like I have to spend all this money either, which sounds ridiculous, but it happens.
Mm, interesting. Rabi, we're coming towards the end of the episode, and I had a really wonderful time talking to you. Thank you
Like,
for this conversation. I guess these questions are more personal and it's more reflective. Um, so, as a founder, how do you personally define success, and has that definition evolved over time?
that's a great question. I wish I had a more thought through answer for that. Look, for me, the most important thing is first and foremost, are we delivering value to our end customers? Um, Many players, especially in B2B SaaS, they kind of like almost, especially when doing sales, they kind of like try and trick their customer into paying for something. And it's like, it's a bit ridiculous. Like, I get you want to have recurring revenue, you want to make sure that you have like healthy contracts, etc. At the same time, I don't want someone paying me if I'm not delivering value to them, right? I
Mm,
always want to deliver significantly more value than how much I'm capturing from the business, right? So for us, that's one of the most important things. Second most, I wouldn't say in order, but another more important thing is uh, as a team, are we learning? Are we growing? Are we improving? Right? And that doesn't have to necessarily be specific skill sets. It can also be in terms of sort of uh, it can be a bit more general than that, right? As people, right? Are we improving as people? Last thing I'd say is like, are we having fun, right? There's no point in doing all of this hard work. There's no point in all these late nights if at the end of the day we hate our lives and it's just all negative. And the reality is, the better we feel about the business, the more we can put into it, the more sustainable things are, the less likely people are to burn out. And so for us, these are like the most important things. And honestly, thinking about that last point that I just made, I'd say that's a realization I had relatively recently, which is like, obviously we work hard and we work a lot, but at the same time, we want to do this for the rest of our lives. And for us to be able to do this for the rest of our lives, we need a routine, right? We need something that like we can do forever, not something that is a 1 week sprint and then, is never recreated again.
Got it. Very solid advice. And I guess one more advice I'm going to ask from you for our viewers who might be students doing their degrees or young professionals who want to make the transition to entrepreneurship. What advice would you give to them if they're thinking about starting their own startup? And is there something you wish somebody told you before you started this path, this journey?
It's a good question. Look, when I speak to people who are young professionals, I always tell them that like the way to look at risk is probably a little bit different to how you are looking at it today. Normally, when you're a consultant, for example, you think starting a company is such a risky activity. But for most people, and this is not the case for everybody, for most people who are in my circle and who I went to university with, for example, the worst case scenario is they try and build a business, it doesn't work, they get a job. That's the worst case scenario. Medium case scenario is it doesn't work, which is more likely, and they get a job, but they actually get a better job because people respect the fact that they took the leap to start something. They became industry experts, right? They're able to leverage that, and then it's always less likely that something is going to be a wild success, but that upside is always there, right? And that upside is very valuable. And if you don't take that leap, you will never have that massive outcome or that big success that you're aiming for. And so like the earlier you start to get those reps in, the better, right? So short advice is you're never going to be ready to start a company. I recommend people do it whenever they feel ready, or honestly as soon as possible. But again, everyone's situation varies. Mileage may vary for anyone, and there's no shame in waiting 20 years either, right?
Sure.
But you're never too young to start a company. And spending time in San Francisco definitely taught me that. So there's a lot of
Really?
young, very cool entrepreneurs and engineers out there. So we should all take inspiration from.
Do you think UK is obviously? I mean, America is the source of entrepreneurship, and the VC has been for a while, for ages now. But do you think London is like significantly lagging behind, or do you think there are improvements you're seeing in the scene?
Look, there's definitely some spikes, right? London's, for example, always been a good place for fintech in general. There are some good AI companies in London as well. DeepMind is a UK company, was probably the first leader in AI. And then 11 Labs today is also a great company as well. The reality is the energy and the optimism in San Francisco is so much further ahead than anywhere else I've seen, not just US, like San Francisco in particular. And I think what we could do within the UK is just more optimism and believing in each other, like less of a zero-sum mindset and more of this like positive thinking, believing in people, taking bets on people. If a 16-year-old engineer in San Francisco is like starting a company, everyone's going to congratulate them. If a 16-year-old starting a company in the UK, my experience, people will tell them like, "What the hell are you doing?" Right?
Yeah.
And it's always good to be a bit of a realist, but at the same time, when we think about entrepreneurship, it's about taking risks. It's about going out there, and it's about building everybody else up. And for us, that's super important. So wherever we go, we try and bring that same energy. And I do think the UK is improving on that front. And I hope that 10 years from now, London is the best place to be an entrepreneur. But yeah, right now it's a little bit behind.
Rabi, this was a wonderful conversation. You're full of insights and wisdom, and I wish you nothing but the best and the success. And I will continue to follow up on your company's success. Yes, thank you so much for your time for this wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.